Welcome everyone to today's event on understanding the paradox of violence in Venezuela. This is an event organized for the Center for Latin American Studies here at the University of Chicago. And we're very excited to have David Smilde, correct me if I'm mispronouncing David. We are very excited to have David Smilde as our speaker for today. David is the Charles and Leo Favreau Professor of Human Relations at the Department of Sociology at Tulane University. He's also a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America. And during this academic year, he's a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And so what David will be talking to us about today is the result, if I understand correctly, of a long-running project with several collaborators who are also joining us here today, Veronica and Rebecca, and so maybe we'll hear a bit from them at the end. And so without further ado, thank you very much, David, for joining us. We're really excited about this.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Luis, for that kind introduction, and thanks to Nelly for organizing this, and to everybody for showing up. It's a pleasure to be back at my alma mater, the U of C, although I sure wish I was there and not on my couch, but maybe next time. I'm going to talk about, let me just get my presentation up here. So I'm going to talk about a long-running project, actually a project that is now 6 years in the works, that we just recently, as in the past couple of weeks, sent off the final version of for copy editing at the University of Pittsburgh Press. And this is a book that's called The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Crime and Revolution. Now this book is the result of a discussion over the past 5 or 6 years between scholars working on aspects of violence in Venezuela. This is an effort, a cross-national effort, an effort especially to incorporate Venezuelan scholars in English language discussion. No, instead of simply taking the Venezuelan context and analyzing it in English for English language scholars from the global north, we tried to really make this a cross-national discussion, international discussion. And in fact, the book itself has 6 chapters that were translated from Spanish, precisely because we want to sort of bridge that gap. Oftentimes you have this phenomenon in which the English language literature and the Spanish language literature hardly meet. And so we think it's important to overcome that because of the fact that there's so much interesting research going on in Venezuela on this. And it's also, it's sort of, to my eye, and I have a very broad interest in Venezuela and many different things. It's the one place, it's the one literature in which scholars that are relatively close to the government or closer to the government and scholars that are opponents of the government have been able to actually work together and work on these. That's not true in almost any other area of scholarship in Venezuela. And so I think that's really an important thing to highlight. There's also within Venezuela, one of my collaborators in this, Veronica Subillaga, directs an institution which I think is the leading institute on violence research in Venezuela called RACINE. Veronica is with us here today. And there's a number of scholars within the United States that that are also, excuse me, and that are also working on violence in Venezuela and writing books on it, including Rebecca Hansen, who's also with us and was also a co-editor and co-author of this project. And these discussions included a number of different scholars who, in the end, did not have a chapter in the book for whatever reason, but were integral parts of this discussion, including Ben Lessing of the UNC, of the U of C. So let me just first be clear on what this is. This is a discussion. This has been a 5 to 6 year discussion on these issues among scholars who all have their own independent research agendas. No, this is a picture of our first meeting. It's not a collective research project. We did not get together, design a project and get a bunch of funding for it and try to answer this question. Rather, we brought together scholars that are already working on these issues, all from different perspectives, different methodologies, different disciplines, to discuss this central paradox and try to understand it. And working together, we came up with a conceptual framework. It is not a proven causal explanation. Rather, it's sort of a conceptual framework that we use to bridge together the different findings of our different projects. Okay, so here is the paradox we started with. This is what gives the book its title. This is what sort of our central first motivation was. And it is this paradox, it is this fact that within Venezuela, during the Chavez years, there was a sustained and clear decline in poverty, as you can see in the blue line in this figure. But at the same time, this did not lead to a decline in violence as many people thought would, especially the government. Actually, it coincided with a dramatic increase in violence. And so this provides our paradox. How is this possible? This is something that sort of violates common sense. It's something that violates a lot of public discussion about this, which generally assumes that crime and violence stem from poverty. Okay, so within Venezuela, during this whole period, this was a really heady period. This was a highly discursive period. This whole period that we're talking about is a period of sort of dramatic change, dramatic upheaval that was really discussed. I mean, Venezuela during all this time, there was so much media discussion on all of this, on everything that was going on. And one of the sort of the leading phenomena that often topped polls that asked people about what they were most worried about was in fact violence. And so there was just a lot of discussion of this in the media, and speculation about this in some academic fora as well. And these are sort of the most common explanations. The explanation that Chavismo began with, and one that was widely distributed, is that crime and violence come from need. If you have a class society, if you have capitalist society that ends up excluding a lot of people, and you have poverty and you have need, well, then people will act out. They will try to fulfill their needs through non-institutional ways, and that will lead to violence. And so this was what Chavismo started with, but it was also something they had in common with their political opposition. And so frequently, during this whole period, what you would hear most is you would hear people say, well, look at all the violence, look at how violence is soaring. That means that there's higher poverty. So oftentimes this was inverted to suggest that since we know that poverty is the source of violence, and there's more violence, there must be poverty. Chavez is leading us to poverty. And it's important to realize that now we have actual data that show this, but as this all was happening, it was not at all clear that this is what's going on. At many times during this period, people could plausibly argue that, well, poverty has actually gone up under Chavismo. And so if you were an opponent of the government, you would, for example, look at, look at 1999 when Chavez started versus 2003, and poverty's gone up, or 2004. Or you could say, look at 1999 to 2005, and Chavismo had made no progress in terms of poverty. If you're a government supporter, well, then you would choose say 2004 and say, well, look, from 2004 to 2009, there's been this historic decline in poverty. And this is because from 2002 to 2004, there was a really significant political conflict that included general strike. And that general strike included the oil company, which is the source of most revenue that really keeps Venezuela's economy going. And so you have that big bump there in that blue line that for much of this period threw a lot of people off, and it was not that clear, whether there was progress being made in poverty. I think now, we can look at that line from 1998 to 2012, you can see a pretty steady, if you look at the tendency line, well, then there was actual progress. So I just want to say that, those people that inverted this and say, well, look at all this violence, that means that people are poor, it wasn't absolutely, it's not like they were absolutely denying the data. They were coming up with an explanation. And so that was inaccurate, but that's often how you heard that formulation. The second is one of the classic ideas from the social science of frustration aggression. And that is the idea that you are poor in a context of economic growth. You are poor where other people are rich. That leads to frustration, and that leads you to act out. So the frustration aggression hypothesis explanation of violence is also very common in Venezuela and almost everywhere else. There's also a tendency to look at, and this even among many activists or people working on violence, is to portray this as an issue of family upbringing or a loss of values. If you can read I found this article just a couple months ago and saved it, but you could find articles like this constantly in Venezuela. I don't even remember what crimes they're talking about, but there was a number of really nasty crimes in January. And then this article came out that basically says horrendous crimes demonstrate or expose the loss of values in Venezuela. And they even have a sociologist that confirms this. And this is one of the most common ways of looking at this. So even, for example, some efforts at anti-violence initiatives will do things like take troubled youth out of certain contexts and put them on sports teams or in camps that they're going to learn how to behave properly in society. That's those initiatives are common and have been common for decades. This is also a leading, especially in Venezuela, as a Catholic society, there's this idea that values are your core values, and so there's it's very frequent that this is the leading social explanation. Polls that ask, why is Venezuela seeing this growth in violence? The most common answer will be because of loss of values or because of family values or inadequate family values. Another very common explanation of this is that Hugo Chávez's violent rhetoric is behind this. And so it's very true that Hugo Chávez had violent rhetoric. He would frequently talk in military terms. He would talk about crushing the opposition. He would talk, in very violent terms. There's no doubt about it. And so some people have said, well, it's because of the violence of his rhetoric that you're seeing this increase in violence in society, presumably because people emulate. Actually, it's all the actual mechanism here is usually not worked out very well, but it's usually the idea that somehow people emulate this violent rhetoric, and that's what leads to crime. This is really completely implausible in the sense that most crime or most violence actually happens between young, marginalized men. It has nothing to do with politics. It's much more has to do with local, dominating local sort of crime networks or spaces. And it has very little to do with national level politics. But of course, this is a big issue, and it's often then sort of instrumentalized for national politics. Another explanation is very common, is increasingly common, is the idea of anomie, and that is the idea that Venezuela, you have, and this is very related to the loss of values idea, but in Venezuela, you have this context in which, the old values and the old norms no longer hold people together and get them to participate in society in an appropriate way. And so you have this anomic state. So for example, one scholar suggests that the fact that Hugo Chávez put forward or through a coup in 1992 meant that people no longer respected democratic and legal ways of obtaining power. And the fact that, there was looting in the 1990s also sort of undermines people's respect for private property. And this is sort of a classic anomie explanation. you know, we don't agree with this, and we think that social psychology also is largely absent. The data itself aren't very consistent with this. And we do end up saying below is that, you know, there's something, some people have talked about an anomic state, a state that no longer has institutions that can actually provide security. That far we can go, but in terms of social psychological version of the anomie, we don't buy that. Leftism has also been sort of an explanation that people have said, and people will say, well, you know, the left thinks that violence and crime come from inequality and poverty, and they don't emphasize institutions, they don't emphasize police, and so therefore there's crime. Well, that is, you know, we end up working that way in Venezuela, but it's not, it can't be really used as a broader indictment or of left projects, or it doesn't really fit in terms of left and right that well. Because if you look around the region, you know, if you look at governments that at this time also had somewhat revolutionary or leftist projects, like Ecuador and Bolivia, they had increases in crime, but nothing like Venezuela. You look at Central America, for example, and you have, you know, the most violent part of Central America is the Northern Triangle of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And Nicaragua is really sort of an outlier. And Nicaragua has had a left version of governance for quite a while. And so this doesn't really hold up cross-nationally. And so we think that you have to drill down a little bit further to figure out exactly what's going on. Okay, so our explanation. And let me just start with our basic starting point. No, we do not think in this book, you know, we do not see violence as resulting from a lack of norms or values, the inability to control emotions or biographical trauma. Rather, we see it as an embodied practice that people use to maintain or contest dominance in social relations. You know, violence is a form of social relationship. I won't necessarily, it's a normal form, it's a common form, but it's a form of social interaction. In Venezuela, during Chavismo, the social structures and public institutions provided opportunities for rent seeking, you know, for profits. On the one hand, they also did not offer means for resolution of conflict and were characterized by impunity. And this made violence common. And in a context in which guns are widely available, this violence was increasingly lethal. You know, what at one point might have been fisticuffs was taken out in terms of guns, and that made, you know, this violent context very lethal. Okay, so that's the basic starting point, our basic sort of outlook and understanding. Now let's kind of look at how we do this in Venezuela. First, we look at two what we call transversal factors, and these are transversal in two senses. No, first of all, illicit economies and guns. These are factors that are common throughout the region. The growth in illicit economies, the distribution or the widespread availability of guns are things that have been driving violence throughout the region. We also, including Venezuela, and we also think that these are transversal in that we see these in the four factors I'm going to talk about in just a bit. We see illicit economies running through all of them, as well as guns. In the case of illicit economies, Venezuela during this period, this is also a period in which Plan Colombia really cracked down and violently in some cases on the cocaine trade and pushed some of it into Venezuela. No, so a lot of the exports, the illicit trade in cocaine that would have gone either by sea or by air off of the Pacific or the Caribbean coast of Colombia ended up going through Venezuela because it was relatively safer than Colombia, which had a number of initiatives sponsored by Plan Colombia. And so you had a real increase in drug trafficking in Venezuela during this period. You also have economic distortions that lead to all sorts of different sort of rackets in terms of contraband, you know, everything from milk to gasoline to rice being exported to Colombia and Brazil because of the price distortions created by foreign exchange distortions and price controls. And so there's a lot of illicit economic activity going on in Venezuela, and there's definitely a factor in the level of violence, the rent-seeking opportunities, in the level of violence that happened. In guns, during this period, there's a dramatic increase in the availability of guns. In this period, Venezuela has one of the highest rates in the world in terms of what percentage of violent death happens from guns. And that's because they're so widely available in Venezuela. So those are two transversal factors that run through all of this. And we're going to look at the sort of four factors that we think are relatively unique to Venezuela. Now, the first is, and of course, Venezuela is a oil country. The Venezuelan economy is highly dependent on the export of oil. And during this period, oil really soared. And so here you can see, this is just a basic figure looking at the earnings, Venezuela's earnings, revenue from oil exports, and how they just soared during this period. Whether you just look at the amount of dollars, or if you make it in terms of a constant 2016 dollars, you can see that any way you cut it, there's just a really big growth of oil export. And this is what the economy is dependent upon. It means that there's a lot more resources in the Venezuelan economy. And all this is consistent with a tendency in the literature, a relatively recent tendency that's perhaps best described by a recent book by Marcelo Bergman that is called, the title of the book is More Money, More Crime. And he shows this throughout the region. He doesn't really focus on the Venezuelan case, but he shows throughout the region that this period of growth of violence in Latin America is actually a period of economic growth. And so he has a whole theorization of this. He basically says that the growth of the economy leads to a growth of consumption, which leads to secondary markets for stolen goods. That leads to more crime to satisfy this market, and the crime leads to violence. And so when I read Bergman, I thought this was really compelling, because it was quite consistent with one of the chapters we had, and that is the chapter by Josefina Brunicelli. And she shows something quite similar. She actually just looks at oil rent and compares it to violent crime, and she finds really striking correlations during two periods of the past 40, 50 years in Venezuela. So basically 1970 to 1988, which, in the 70s were an era of increasing oil revenue. There's a 0.58 correlation between oil revenue, oil earnings, and violence. In other words, oil is a direct correlation. So the more oil revenue increases, the more violent crime there is. She also finds the same correlation between 1999 and 2016. In other words, during the Chavez period. And here the correlation is actually 0.75. When oil revenue goes up, violent crime goes up. And so this is really quite consistent with Bergman's idea, more money, more crime. And so my original idea was to think that, you have this increase in oil rent, that increases economic growth, and that increases, consumption, secondary markets, crime to meet these secondary markets, increases violence. And I thought this was quite compelling. My two co-authors, co-editors and co-authors were much less compelled by this, and ended up pointing out that the data actually show that during this period, property crime is constant, actually. During all this economic growth, there's not actually an increase in property crime. So we don't actually bring that in. We sort of mentioned that the problem with property crime figures is that they're very unreliable. And so that's why so much criminology looks at homicide rates, because they're much more likely to have accurate statistics. But the simple fact of the matter is that there is no evidence that property crime increased. And if that didn't increase, well, then Bergman's explanation doesn't actually fit directly on this. Now, clearly there's something similar going on. I think the real I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but if you look at this period in this figure from 1989, 1998, the neoliberal period, there's actually no relationship here. You know, poverty goes down, in which this explanation would suggest that would mean violence would go down, but actually violence goes up. And so I think that's a first indication that something else is going on here. And it likely has to do with institutions, because in Venezuela's neoliberal period, this was also a period in which many state institutions were mined, were sort of really hollowed out. There's also a moment of decentralization of policing throughout the country. And so we think that sort of indicates that there was something different going on in the neoliberal period. Okay, so what Brunicelli actually does find when she does a big multi-staged multiple regression, if you look at the correlations, she finds that correlations between violent crime and the following independent variables, the GDP per capita, growth rate, inequality, and unemployment, are all insignificant. No, so that shows, in fact, that there is something different going on. What she finds is significant is rule of law, informality, which is just really another way of measuring rule of law, because informality basically means there's economic activity that's not covered by the legal structures of the state. And impunity. All of these things are extremely significant in understanding violent crime. Okay, so so there's still the issue of exactly what the mechanism is there. What she finds significant suggests that this is about sort of structures of governance, and this is perhaps our most important explanatory factor, the one that takes up the most real estate in our introduction, and this is the idea of revolutionary governance. There's a lot of elements to this. A revolutionary governance, you know, Chavez came in and he portrayed as what he was doing as a revolution, and his followers also considered themselves as carrying out a revolution. They very much wanted to upend existing structures of Venezuela. No. And of course, when you do that, there are winners and there are losers. And so one of the first sort of impacts of this is really far-reaching polarization. As you have in Venezuela, the traditional political, economic, social, and cultural elite of Venezuela, not inaccurately, saw this as a threat to their interests and very vigorously pushed against Chavez. No, so from the, you know, once the new constitution was written, and once Chavez started to really push to sort of democratize the economy, for example, that led to real difficulties. So already 2001, there was a first one-day general strike. 2002, there was a actual coup attempt. No, Chavez was pushed out, was out of power for 36 hours. Or 48 hours, but eventually was brought back by loyal military. Then from 2002 to 2003, there was a massive general strike that sought to push and force Chavez from power. After that, then there was a process, another year of sort of conflict as the whole society, as the opposition, and pushed for a recall referendum, and Chavismo tried to prevent it. So all of this led to a sort of polarization, which meant that on the one hand, within the government, led to a sort of politicization. Within the government, government officials sort of were not really focused on what their function were, but were focused on, you know, how do we support this government? How do we support this revolutionary project? You know, everything else can be set to the side. So people participated, you know, state institutions participated in marches. They participated in all kinds of propaganda efforts. No, so if you look at this, the photo I have here, this is actually from relatively recently. It says, "I'm a revolutionary, I'm Chavista, I'm Bolivariano," and then it has hashtag, "You don't speak badly of Chavez here." Now, this is clearly a very highly politicized message. which of course that's fine in democracy. But if you look at it, above this is from CENIAT. This is from the CENIAT webpage. CENIAT is like the IRS. It's the tax agency in Venezuela. It's just another government bureaucracy. But like most government bureaucracies, have seen the need to actually become Chavista and demonstrate that repeatedly. And in many cases, that has undermined or made them much less effective in their actual. I mean, you can imagine that if the IRS said, if we had Trump for another 4 years, maybe the IRS probably would have something like this on their webpage saying that I am a Trump, we are Trump or something like that. But this is the case in Venezuela. This is what happened in a lot of public administrations, that it got completely politicized. And then also on the opposition side. So during this period, it was not the case that Chavez controlled everything across the country. There were many parts of the government and there were many local governments that were in opposition hands. And so oftentimes they completely resisted the government's plans as well. If the government tried to do something about citizen security, oftentimes they would get a lot of pushback from opposition governors and mayors. Okay, so within Chavismo itself, there was also a lot of internal conflict. And so you have all these extraordinary resources coming into the government. You have a government that considers itself revolutionary. And in the case of most revolutionary movements, there's massive internal conflict, all kinds of different tendencies, from people that are more reformist to people that are more radical, that have different concepts of what socialism is, of what Chavismo should be, and who is loyal and who's not. And so all kinds of networks and all kinds of internal conflict, which ended up having a real impact on the police reform, as I'll mention in just a minute. Also important here, and this is where the guns part comes in, is that Chavez would, during a certain period, especially after the coup attempt in 2002, he really emphasized this idea that this was a peaceful but armed revolution. Of course, this was a message he wanted the US government, the Colombian government, because he was always, not unreasonably fearful of some sort of intervention in Venezuela, but also, more broadly, basically the idea that we are armed and we are going to push forward this revolution no matter what. And in many cases, this led within the Chavez government to sort of an outsourcing of security functions. There was a lot of relationship to colectivos, to armed colectivos, and just groups that would be armed, the government would arm, that carried out security functions. And so with that, you had a real increase. That's one of the reasons of the increase in guns in Venezuelan society. Okay, so another factor here is the idea of concentrated disadvantage. So what we showed from the beginning is this idea that poverty declined and violence increased. But the thing is, those are national level statistics, that look at income levels and households, and those national level statistics can really cover over a lot of pockets of persisting poverty, which again probably are not relevant because of frustration, aggression, or loss of values, but rather create these pockets in which there's just not coverage of state institutions or state initiatives. So many of Chavez's social policy efforts were not universal. Oftentimes they were aimed at specific sectors, at mothers with children, at grandparents, to finish high school. So there were a lot of policies that, by design were not universal in their coverage. And they ended up creating a lot of benefits gaps and a lot of sort of rent opportunities that some people benefited and some people did not. When you look at them, the least benefited of all sectors in the government's social policies were usually young men, and this is, of course, is the primary demographic of people that tend to commit violent crimes. And so this is an issue. What we see then is sort of the creation of pockets of insecurity, pockets in which this change, this decline in poverty did not have an impact that created the type of public institutions and local social structures that could reduce violence and create a sense of collective efficacy among populations. It just didn't happen. And so you have this even though you have this growth, this decline in poverty, you still have these real pockets of complete abandonment. And so this picture is actually, one of the big policies was Misión Vivienda, was the housing mission that created all kinds of housing units. And so we're using this as just sort of as a metaphor for this process, in which you can imagine that those who got apartments in this particular residence were benefited, but those in the ranchos, in the self-constructed housing all around are still there and we're not benefited. So it's just sort of a metaphor of the larger fact that a lot of these social policies created gaps. And so you have this process of concentrated disadvantage. It's a concept that's used in U.S. Sociological and criminological research on the relationship of poverty and crime, that tries to get beyond just blanket suggestions that poverty leads to crime, but showing how you do get these pockets in which crime can be incredibly common. And finally, another factor explaining Venezuela's violence is the idea is policing. That Venezuela really is a country in which police have failed to provide security for its citizens. This, in the first 6 or 7 years of Chavismo, this was because the government pretty much completely ignored police. They thought that that's, police are something, in a classic Marxist way, police are something that are necessary because of a class society in which there's dramatic inequality and poverty. And if we reduce these things, well, we won't need police. And so why focus on them? Why invest in them? Let's focus on social policy and economic growth and just, get poverty to decline. Of course, they did that and it didn't work. So in 2006, there was a series of really high profile murders and really terrible kidnappings and murders. And that generated public outrage and protests at a time that it was clear that, violence was increasing, not decreasing. And that finally got the government to sort of take this problem by the horns and say, well, we're going to address this. They put together a commission on police reform that does a big study on Venezuelan policing and then comes up with a law. It comes up with a proposal for a law by the end of 2006. However, in 2007, Chávez changes the Minister of Interior and Justice, and this new minister comes in and basically says this is a right-wing plan, puts it in the back burner, files it away, and for a year, the plan is dead. But a new minister comes in 2008, says, no, we're doing this. They quickly pass the law, and Venezuela comes up with this, which was really quite an interesting effort at police reform. It was perhaps a little less novel than they like to think in terms of its actual content. It was pretty similar to a lot of police reform efforts. It did focus on things like human rights aspects, for example, the progressive and differential use of force, which sounds sort of obvious, but it's the idea that you only use force in a defensive way, not an offensive way. You use force in instances in which the officer or other citizens are in danger. No, the traditional Venezuela, like many police forces in the region, their origins are military and their mindset is military, their training is military. So it's very common in Venezuela, traditional Venezuelan policing, that when a criminal is fleeing, running away, shoot him in the back, just you stop him, just like a soldier would do in war, rather than only shooting if you're threatened. And so this was one of the key elements. The idea was to create a civilian police force that had human rights training. They had some of the basic training of civil rights. It was actually a quite interesting effort. By Chávez's last year as president, I should say there was also, it started to expand. It was an effort that then encompassed an effort at gun control, at arms control, and had a presidential commission for that as well. By 2012, beginning of 2012, Chávez brought all this into an effort called Misión a toda vida Venezuela. In other words, like full life mission of Venezuela, and that brought in all these different initiatives and tried to coordinate them. However, by the time that he was reelected in 2012, shortly after that, he took Tarek El Aissami, who was the minister that headed this whole reform, or sort of promoted it, and made him a governor, a candidate for governor. And that sort of left this reform adrift. Of course, then Chavez died. And then after that, with Maduro really sort of disassembled this. But already, during Chavismo, it's important to know that this reform had less than 100% support. Chavez himself is a military man, and had to be convinced that this was the right thing to do, that they needed a police reform. No, it wasn't his normal way of thinking about it. And while this police reform was happening, and in fact, the same year, I think the same month that the national police actually hit the streets, these new civilian police corps, Chavez also put forward something called the Divice, which was the bicentennial initiative on security, on citizen security, which basically had National Guard, which is National Guard troops going into barrios with these police raids that would shoot up a barrio and commit all kinds of human rights violations to supposedly confront crime. And so this photo you can see, this is actually more recent police militarized operation, police raid. But this type of thing happened during Chavismo as well, because he was also a military. And within this, for example, within Chavismo, as we said, there are ideological. So there was some real opposition to police reform, and that led some of the police reformers to really emphasize the sort of humanistic elements rather than sort of the effectiveness elements. And of course, a big part of the government was military officials. Where a lot of the government officials were military officials, and the military traditionally controls citizen security, and that takes away part of their domain. And of course, with this domain are all kinds of opportunities for graft, for kickbacks. The military was what imported all the arms, would import things like bulletproof vests. They also run the factory that creates 80% of the ammunition that's used in Venezuela. And so there was all kinds of interest there within Chavismo itself that really sort of led this effort at police reform to fail, and let this the traditional militarized policing in Venezuela, which never disappeared, to sort of surge to the fore. And especially in the case of Nicolas Maduro, that's what becomes its sort of primary technique for fighting crime. Okay, so about 10 more minutes. Okay, so here's our framework in sum. As we see it, this is the framework that has derived from this discussion among scholars researching Venezuela. This is our way of bringing it all together and figuring out where we are. We think that the presence of illicit economies and the widespread availability of guns, in the presence of a hypertrophic state, a state that had so much resources that it's almost burst the institutions that were there, a model of revolutionary governance, a persistence of concentrated disadvantage, and failed policing led to soaring levels of violence in Venezuela. That's sort of where we are to try and explain that paradox. That's what we do in the introduction, Becca Hansen and Veronica Subiaga and I. And so then I'd like to end by just taking a look at what has happened since then. And these academic productions just take a long time. Writing this all together, then going through several rounds of peer review, and this takes years. And so we're talking about the present. It'd be great if we were talking about the 19th century, nothing changes. But we're talking about the present, and our analytic target, our empirical reality changes as we're analyzing it. And so this is a very interesting development. This is what we sort of dedicate the conclusion of this edited volume, which we end up calling final reflections, because of the fact that we don't really think we can come up with conclusions, because as you'll see, this phenomenon is moving. Okay, so here we have this is what's happened in 2006 since 2016. 2016 was the high point in violence in Venezuela, in violent deaths. And you can see that year there was 28,000 deaths, violent deaths in Venezuela. 18,000 or so of those were homicide, no, and the others were qualified as something else. No, one of the ways the government had developed to sort of try to underestimate or not assume the homicide rate is by calling a lot of them undetermined. So if they get a report of a body in the street, it might even have a bullet wound, but there's no witnesses and there's no indication of what happened, they would call that a death under investigation. No, and not count that as a homicide, because nobody says, well, we saw someone shoot him, or we know who did it, or there's accusation, or it's clear that there was a homicide. They'll call that undetermined. And that's one way that they had of sort of reducing the numbers of homicides that were counted in statistics. The other is resistance to arrest, and so you can see through all this period about 5,000 people a year are killed by the police, and oftentimes these are executions, but they're always counted as somebody that resisted arrest, even if they're shot in the back. So this is interesting. This is we can see from 2016 to 2019, over the course of 4 years, there's a decline of around 40% of violent deaths, even if you take into account all three sources of these figures. So the question is, what does this mean? Does this support our analysis? Does this contradict it? And this is what we try to do in the concluding chapter of the book. We try to explain this 42% decline in violent death. We try to explain this inversion of the paradox, And so we sort of document what people have said and try to come up with our own suggestions based on literature and based on emerging empirical work that's still very much in process. And so these are all sort of reflections. On one hand, Venezuela's population has been reduced by about 5% during this period. There's actually been an outmigration that's been at least 10%, perhaps 15% during this period. UN statistics put it at about 5 million people have left Venezuela since 2015. And so perhaps this is why the population is simply smaller, and therefore, in percentage terms, the death rate is the same. But, the number of the mathematics don't actually work there, because the decline of violent death is 42%. The decline of the population is only 5%, because in Venezuela, while you have this outmigration, the rate of replacement is still high, is still positive in Venezuela. In other words, the birth rate is higher than the natural death rate. And so the population is only declined by 5%. You could say perhaps maybe those who have exited tend to be more violent or were more involved in crime, but that would take actual data to really confirm that. Of course, this whole period, as has been amply covered in the international media, is one of economic contraction. It's one in which Venezuela economy has really diminished in size. It's now less than half the size it was 5-6 years ago. And this has meant an increase in poverty, even putting it conservatively, from 46% to 64% at this time. And so we have this, there is very clearly a decline in poverty, or decline in economic well-being, and decline in the economy. And so at the same time that there's a decline in violent deaths. So that sort of replicates this paradox. But here again, it's not entirely clear how this works, because in the terms that Bergman uses in his explanation, still property crime is not like property crime had not increased during the period of economic growth, and it seems to have decreased, but not a whole lot. And so it's not clear that is really what's going on. And it doesn't seem that state institutions are any more effective. In fact, they seem to be less effective than before. So that's still what's going on there is not entirely clear. One thing that is emerging, and that several of our the participants in this book, in this project, are working on, is the idea that this militarized policing has led to an increasing, or any number of different factors, has led to an increasing organization of criminal gangs and networks. And so, as I mentioned before, during the Maduro period, Maduro himself is, really emphasized these militarized initiatives. In fact, if you follow discussion of human rights in Venezuela, the fact-finding mission that the United Nations fact-finding mission that went to Venezuela and came with a report suggested that Nicolas Maduro's government and Nicolas Maduro himself be investigated for crimes against humanity, precisely because of these militarized initiatives and how many people that they've killed. And so, what then is the impact of these? So in certain contexts, it's clear that they lead to more violence. Oftentimes, they will push a certain gang out of an area, and then there'll be a fight over territory again. And so you end up getting some really big massacres. But what we're also seeing is that these militarized police initiatives are also sort of leading criminal gangs to organize amongst themselves, create pacts with each other, and in certain contexts with the government. And this is something that Ben Lessing just talked to us the other day at Tulane, and that he's finding in Brazil as well. And so this is really at the edge of research right now. That's what people are looking at. And this is kind of what we're seeing in Venezuela, consistent with his research in Brazil. And then just finally, to end, what we're also seeing is that these criminal gang networks, there's been a displacement of a lot of these illicit markets into rural areas. And so what we've seen over the past number of years is, and we have a chapter on this, is a real increase in rural violence. At the same time that violence in urban areas stagnates or declines, there's a real increase in rural areas. So a lot of these gangs have gone to rural areas. There's also some evidence that there was a diversification and entry into illicit economy, into illicit activities, for example, cacao exploitation, and that some of these gangs have gotten into this. Of course, this is a classic, this is what aspects of the mafia did as well, is get into things like trash collection. And so this is what we're seeing. This is sort of where we end at the present, and sort of on the edge of our current knowledge, but there's a lot of research going on this. Okay, thank you very much.
While we collect some questions, David, I wanted to abuse my privileges as moderator and ask you one or two of my own to get things started. The first question that I had in mind was, like, the whole starting point for the project is this tension between the increasing crime during the Chavismo years with this reduction in poverty. And looking at the graph you showed us, I was very struck by this rapid decline, especially around 2007, 2008, where we're talking about like a 20-point reduction in the poverty rate in a matter of 1 or 2 years. And then at some point you talked about these, I can't remember the exact expression you used, but how certain groups of the population had not been reached by this progress. And to me, that really struck a chord in terms of the reduction in poverty perhaps not being associated with sustained improvements in economic opportunities, particularly for young men. And my suspicion would be that the reduction in poverty came about mostly through an increase in direct transfers subsidized by oil money, not so much by investment in long-run growth, education, health. I mean, you talked a bit about housing. So my impression is that this was like a very volatile reduction in poverty, because as long as the price of oil is high, you can keep funding these transfers and things look good in the data, but it's not like you are really creating economic opportunities for all of these people, which to some extent, and I'll let you answer after this, I really liked that graph where you showed that crime started increasing around 1989, which is consistent with kind of the system starting to implode. I believe Caracazo takes place in that year. And so this is very much consistent with this idea that pockets of young, underprivileged people, they start to feel they have no real economic opportunities and they turn to crime, and that the reduction in poverty, while it looks very good in the data, it did not imply a really meaningful transformation of economic opportunities. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. No, I think that's really interesting question. I mean, I think actually what was going on is a little bit different. I mean, I think it gets at sort of your suspicions, but in a slightly different direction, in that I emphasized quite a bit social policy in the discussion, and that's a little bit misleading because most of the great majority of the poverty reduction really happened because of economic activity. And so a lot of this economic activity, of course, the government controls oil resources, but they just spent like crazy, And so all kinds of construction projects, all kinds of state-led different sort of projects put a lot of money into the economy, but that meant a real growth of the private sector. And so what you had is a lot of growth in terms of construction, a lot of growth in terms of transportation, a lot of growth in consumption. So, commercial activity, and all of those things are economic activities that are highly susceptible to the economy. And so when the economy goes down, I mean, that sounds kind of like, oh, okay, well, economic activity, that's great. And compared to direct transfers, that would be more resilient to economic downturn. But they really aren't, because in the end, it was always so dependent on state spending. The government put the money into the economy and the private sector responded, and that led to a lot more employment, a lot more growth. But it was also highly susceptible because it was not growth in, for example, manufacturing, in terms of agricultural activity or those kind of core economic activities. It was all things that were very much sort of dependent on state-led economic growth. And so when the economy goes down, they're very susceptible to that.
Thank you, David, for that. I'm going to group a couple of questions here. There's some interest on what you mentioned about the availability of guns. So on the one hand, Lourdes asked a while ago if you could tell us a bit more about this increase in the supply of guns and weapons, like what are the causes? And then Cesar is, I guess, thinking a bit about the decline in violence that you showed us in these later years, and asking whether the economic situation may also be affecting criminal groups' ability to fund and purchase or access weaponry and so on.
Right, okay. You know what, I have with me my two collaborators, and so I would like to defer the question on guns to Veronica Subiaga, because she has a chapter in this book on guns, and she's the one that's most closely followed that and was actually part of the Presidential Commission on Gun Control. And so I don't know if Veronica is there. Could you turn on your mic?
Veronica?
Hi.
Direct from Venezuela.
Yes. Thank you for the question. Actually, this is a very interesting subject, and we understand the availability of guns during the second factor that we call revolutionary governance. And what we can see, and also among the assistants, we have Jose Luis Fernandez Shaw, who has worked a lot on that subject too. So what we would like to highlight here is that during it, especially after the coup d'etat in 2002, we started to hear very persistently that the Bolivarian process was pacific but armed revolution. So in the face of a real threat that the government failed vis-a-vis Colombia, but also vis-a-vis an imperialist invasion, what had started to happen is that the government indeed started to distribute guns among civilians as well. So we have the consolidation of parastatal armed groups. But you know that guns are running objects and they travel from groups to groups. So then guns have been stolen, lended, sold. So you have, in my work, for instance, we started to see how guns, in a context of chronic lack of justice, people were starting to solve daily life conflicts through guns. So what you are having is that daily conflicts began or turned into lethal conflicts. So this is so we to end and to summarize, we understand this availability of guns in the frame of this revolutionary governance and the fact that we had a peaceful but armed revolution.
Okay, and so the other question there, let me just quickly address that about whether this economic decline affected, these armed groups as well, ability to secure weapons, and that is something that there's some journalistic evidence of that. That there's interviews of of people that say no, they can't afford bullets anymore, they can't afford to replace their guns and whatnot. So there is that, and we cover that. We mentioned that in the final reflections. I'm not entirely convinced by that, but I think that's fair. I think it needs more research to see if that whether the price of a bullet is too much to no longer commit a crime. I personally, I'm a little skeptical of that, but that is out there, and there have been some journalistic reports on that. It's something that definitely that we're looking at.
No, but we will add that it's not that there is enough money to buy bullets, but we are looking at more sophisticated organization among criminal groups. So you have a more regulated violence. So that's one of the explanations as well.
Thank you, Veronica. Juan Rodriguez asks a very interesting question, something that I don't think you discussed too much in your presentation, which is, have you given some thought to changes in the operation of prisons, which I guess could affect crime both as a source of deterrence, but also we know that within prisons, people establish links and they in fact create more crime and so on. And I guess it could be prisons, but more broadly, the way the judicial or the criminal system is operated. Like in general, what would be your thoughts about the importance of that side of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have a chapter by Andres Antillano on the prison situation, and that chapter, as I said, this is always a moving target, and so he suggests he tries to work against a little bit the idea that in Venezuela crime is controlled from prisons, and I think clearly there are contexts such as Brazil, for example. In Ben's work and Robert Gay's work that shows how much crime is organized from prisons. The chapter, Andres' chapter in this book, which was written a couple of years ago, suggests that oftentimes is overestimated in the Venezuela case. Now, whether that's still true right now, I'm not sure. In fact, I just saw that our friend Luis Duno and Andres Antillano have a new edited volume on prisons that came out, and so I'll be really interested to look at that and see what they have to say on that topic. But clearly, more broadly, the level of dysfunction in the judicial system and corrections is a really big part of this. Venezuela during this whole period has seen its judicial system sort of really undermined. Most judges in Venezuela, the one figure I saw was close to 80% of are provisional judges, are judges that do not have tenure, as should be the case in a judicial system like this. And that just puts them in a very precarious position in which concentrating on their actual work is not a priority. Other things are priorities to try and keep their jobs. And so there's very serious judicial dysfunction. There's very serious dysfunction in the prison system as well, and that also leads to a lot of violence within prisons and a lot of circulation in sort of the violent economy between prisons and the outside. So all of that, one of the things that we suggest, one of the problems with Venezuela's police reform model was that it really focused on policing, on arms, and only much later and secondarily looked at, included effort at prison reform, and never really included any kind of judicial reform. But all those things for a really solid effort at citizen security reform really would need to happen together.
Let me ask one very final question because we're running short on time and I don't want this to go unanswered. Heather asked a while ago about whether you have looked at other forms of violence, such as intra-household violence against women. And I guess a broader way to frame that question would be, when you look at the increase in violent crime, have you unpacked it a bit in terms of which groups in the population are most affected by the increase in crime?
Okay, well, I would like to defer this to my other collaborator, Rebecca Hansen, if she wants to take this, because she added an important element to our introduction precisely on this point of what type of violence we're actually looking at. And so, Becca, do you want to quickly comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really important question, and it's something we've talked about more recently while wrapping the book up. So, I mean, it is the case that the type of violence that we're looking at is the kind of violence that tends to be used in most studies, because homicide rates are consistently the kind of easiest forms of crime to measure, right? And are more commonly reported than other types of crime. And I think that there's an important critique there of the large majority of work in sociology and criminology and our focus on homicides and violent crime. So one of the things that we suggest early on in the book, we don't delve into it too deeply, but I mean, we do recognize that given the type of crime that we're looking at, which homicide and violent crime, because the majority of homicide victims, as well as those involved in that type of crime, are men, that it is possible that the explanations that we're putting forward might be better at accounting for lethal violence against men. And of course, we recognize that there needs to be additional work on the killing of queer populations, transgender groups, and women as well. And it is interesting. I mean, it is important to note that femicides have been going up in Venezuela as well over the past few years. So we recognize that our explanations may not necessarily cover a lot of those different other forms of violence, but we do think still that the factors that we identify, like institutional weakening and the fracturing of police reform, would probably be important in understanding those other expressions of violence, maybe in different ways and to different degrees. But that area definitely still needs to be developed much more.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that answer. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I think we could talk about this for hours. I took like 2 pages worth of notes. It's a fascinating endeavor. So congratulations, David, Veronica, Rebecca, and to all of your other collaborators. Thank you for a fascinating talk, David. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. It was fun.